I never thought my life would change because of one girl. It was always me and Daniel Cross. We did everything together: school, lunch, dreams, and future plans. He felt like a brother to me. Life was simple and stable until Olivia Blake joined our class. The first time I saw her, I felt something shift inside me. She walked in with confidence that made everyone notice her. Even Daniel started acting different around her, but I ignored it at first. I thought nothing could break us. I was wrong. "Bro, did you see the new girl?" Daniel asked me during lunch. I shrugged. "Yeah, just another student." "Why?" He smiled like I had missed something important. "Her name is Olivia Blake. She's different." "Different how?" I asked, taking a bite of my sandwich. "You'll see," he said, eyes still on her across the cafeteria. I turned slightly. Olivia was laughing with Mia Blake near the window. Something about her presence felt loud even when she was quiet. I tried to ignore it. "You're staring?" Daniel teased. "I'm not," I said quickly. He laughed. "Relax, Ethan. It's not like I'm replacing you." That line stayed in my head longer than it should have. Days passed and Daniel started talking about her more. "She gets math instantly," he said one afternoon. "And she actually listens when teachers talk." I replied, "Good for her." But inside something tightened. I didn't like how often her name came up. One day I saw them working together in class. Olivia was explaining something, and Daniel was nodding like she was the only person in the room. I felt invisible. "Hey Daniel," I called. He looked up. "Oh Ethan. We're just finishing this." Olivia looked at me briefly. "Hi," she said softly. "Hey," I replied, trying to sound normal. Daniel smiled. "She's helping me with math. She's really smart." I forced a nod. "Cool." But I walked away before they could say anything else. Later Daniel caught up with me. "Why are you acting weird?" "I'm not," I said. "You are. Ever since Olivia joined, you've been off." I stopped walking. "I just don't get why she's suddenly the center of everything." He frowned. "Nobody is replacing you, Ethan." "Feels like it," I muttered. He sighed. "You're overthinking." But I wasn't sure anymore. That night I kept replaying everything in my head. The way Daniel looked at her. The way I felt left out. I told myself it was nothing. But deep down, I knew something between us was starting to change. The next morning at school I tried to act normal, but it felt harder than before. Daniel was already sitting with Olivia when I arrived. They were talking like I wasn't even part of the world anymore. "Morning," I said, dropping my bag. Daniel looked up. "Oh hey Ethan." Olivia smiled politely. "Hi Ethan." I nodded and sat down, but the space between us felt strange. "What were you two talking about?" I asked. "Just the project," Daniel said. "We're partners now." I frowned. "Since when?" "Since yesterday," he replied casually. Something inside me tightened again. "I didn't know groups changed," I said. Olivia spoke softly. "Teacher allowed us to adjust based on strengths." I forced a small laugh. "Strengths, huh?" Daniel glanced at me. "Don't start." "I'm not starting anything," I said. But I could feel my voice getting sharper. Later in class, I noticed James Carter watching me from across the room. After class he pulled me aside. "You good, Ethan?" he asked. "Yeah," I said quickly. He raised an eyebrow. "Doesn't look like it." I hesitated. "It's just Daniel and Olivia." He nodded slowly. "New people change things." "They shouldn't," I said. He shrugged. "That's life." I didn't like that answer. At lunch, I sat alone for the first time in months. Daniel waved at me from across the table, but he stayed with Olivia. I didn't wave back. "You're avoiding me," Daniel said later when he finally came over. "I'm not," I replied. "Then why are you sitting alone?" I looked away. Maybe I just needed space. He sighed. "From me?" "From everything," I said quietly. Olivia walked past us then and she paused. "Everything okay?" I forced a smile. "Yeah. All good." But she didn't look convinced. Daniel turned to her. "We'll talk later." As they walked away together, I stayed frozen in place, watching them leave. For the first time, I realized it wasn't just my imagination anymore. That evening, I walked home slower than usual, replaying everything Daniel said. I kept telling myself I didn't care, but every step felt heavier than the last. When I reached my room, I dropped my bag and stared at the ceiling. My phone buzzed. A message from Daniel. "Are we okay?" I didn't reply right away. I wanted to, but something stopped me. After a long pause, I typed, "I don't know." I stared at those words before sending them. A minute later, another message came. "Talk to me tomorrow." I turned off my phone and lay back down. For the first time, I wondered if friendship could really change this fast, or if I had just been blind all along. I couldn't sleep that night. I noticed it first in small things. Daniel started sitting with Olivia Blake more often and I tried to ignore it. But it didn't stop there. I told James Carter about it and he just laughed and said I was overthinking everything. "You're imagining it," James said. I replied, "I don't think so. I can feel something changing." Daniel kept smiling around Olivia like she was the only person in his world. When I called him, he still acted normal, but I could see the distance growing. One afternoon, I finally asked him directly, "Are we still the same, Daniel?" I said. He looked at me and smiled. "Yeah, of course we are." But his eyes didn't match his words. I nodded, but I felt worse after that. Olivia walked past us and said, "Hey," like nothing had changed. I said hi back, but my voice sounded strange even to me. Daniel didn't notice. He was already talking to Olivia again. I pulled Daniel aside after class. "We need to talk." "What about?" he asked. I hesitated, then said, "You've been different lately." Daniel sighed and crossed his arms. "Different how?" he asked. I looked away before answering. "It's just Olivia," I said. Daniel frowned immediately. "Why are you bringing her up like that?" I said, "Because everything changed after she came." He shook his head. "You're overthinking again." I laughed once, but it wasn't real. I said, "Then why do I feel like I'm losing my best friend?" Daniel went quiet for a moment. That silence hurt more than anything he could have said. "Look," Daniel said, "nothing is changing between us." But he didn't even look at me properly. I said, "Then why do I feel like I'm being replaced?" Daniel hesitated. "Replaced? That's ridiculous." I clenched my fist. "You don't see it, do you?" I asked. "See what?" he snapped. I took a breath. "You and Olivia, you're always together now." Daniel rubbed his forehead. "She's just a friend helping me." I shook my head. "It doesn't feel like that." Olivia appeared at the end of the hallway. She looked between us and said softly, "Am I interrupting?" I said nothing. Daniel turned to her quickly. "No, we're just talking." I felt something inside me drop. I said, "I think I should go." Daniel looked surprised. "Why?" he asked. I said, "You two seem fine without me." Daniel stepped closer. "That's not true." I laughed quietly. "Then why does it feel like it?" Olivia spoke again. "Maybe you both need space," she said. I didn't like hearing that. I said, "You don't get to decide that." Olivia stayed calm. "I wasn't deciding anything." Daniel raised his voice slightly. "Stop acting like I'm doing something wrong." I stepped back. "Then explain why I feel replaced every day." Daniel looked frustrated. "You're making this bigger than it is." I shook my head again. "No, I'm finally seeing it." Olivia looked uncomfortable. "I think I should leave," she said. Daniel shook his head. "Stay," he said quickly. I felt something break inside me at that moment. I said quietly, "It's fine. I'll go." Daniel said, "Ethan, wait." I stopped walking but didn't turn around. "What do you want from me, Daniel?" I asked. I heard him hesitate. "I want things to be normal again." I laughed bitterly. "Normal? Nothing is normal anymore." Olivia said softly, "This isn't helping." Daniel finally walked closer to me. "Ethan, you're my best friend." I looked at him directly. "Then act like it." Silence fell between all three of us. I could hear my own heartbeat. Olivia broke the silence. "Maybe this is getting out of control." I nodded slowly. "Yeah, it already is." Daniel looked like he didn't know what to say. I finally turned back to Daniel. "Do you choose her over everything we had?" I asked. Daniel froze. "That's not fair," he said quietly. I shook my head. "I just want the truth." Daniel lowered his gaze. "I don't know what's happening anymore." Olivia stepped back slowly. I felt my chest tighten. I said, "Then maybe we're already over." Daniel whispered, "Don't say that." I looked away. "But it's already being said in my head." Silence stretched again. Daniel finally spoke again, his voice softer now. "I don't want to lose you." I felt my throat tighten. "Then don't." Olivia looked between us again. "This isn't just about me," she said quietly. I nodded. "It never was." I stepped back slowly. "Whatever this is, I can't do it anymore like this." Daniel reached out but stopped. I turned away completely. "I just need space from all of you." I walked down the hallway alone. Behind me I heard Daniel call my name but I didn't stop. Olivia didn't say anything. I kept walking, feeling something inside me finally break in silence. I stopped outside the school gate. I didn't look back. Maybe James was right, I whispered to myself. But it didn't change how empty I felt. The friendship I trusted was already gone. I stood there for a long time before walking home alone under the fading sky. I knew nothing would ever be the same again. Not anymore. Everything had already changed forever inside me. I noticed it first in small things. Daniel started sitting with Olivia Blake more often and I tried to ignore it. But it didn't stop there. I told James Carter about it and he just laughed and said I was overthinking everything. "You're imagining it," James said. I replied, "I don't think so. I can feel something changing." Daniel kept smiling around Olivia like she was the only person in his world. When I called him, he still acted normal, but I could see the distance growing. One afternoon, I finally asked him directly, "Are we still the same, Daniel?" I said. He looked at me and smiled. "Yeah, of course we are." But his eyes didn't match his words. I nodded, but I felt worse after that. Olivia walked past us and said, "Hey," like nothing had changed. I said hi back, but my voice sounded strange even to me. Daniel didn't notice. He was already talking to Olivia again. I pulled Daniel aside after class. "We need to talk." "What about?" he asked. I hesitated, then said, "You've been different lately." Daniel sighed and crossed his arms. "Different how?" he asked. I looked away before answering. "It's just Olivia," I said. Daniel frowned immediately. "Why are you bringing her up like that?" I said, "Because everything changed after she came." He shook his head. "You're overthinking again." I laughed once, but it wasn't real. I said, "Then why do I feel like I'm losing my best friend?" Daniel went quiet for a moment. That silence hurt more than anything he could have said. "Look," Daniel said, "nothing is changing between us." But he didn't even look at me properly. I said, "Then why do I feel like I'm being replaced?" Daniel hesitated. "Replaced? That's ridiculous." I clenched my fist. "You don't see it, do you?" I asked. "See what?" he snapped. I took a breath. "You and Olivia, you're always together now." Daniel rubbed his forehead. "She's just a friend helping me." I shook my head. "It doesn't feel like that." Olivia appeared at the end of the hallway. She looked between us and said softly, "Am I interrupting?" I said nothing. Daniel turned to her quickly. "No, we're just talking." I felt something inside me drop. I said, "I think I should go." Daniel looked surprised. "Why?" he asked. I said, "You two seem fine without me." Daniel stepped closer. "That's not true." I laughed quietly. "Then why does it feel like it?" Olivia spoke again. "Maybe you both need space," she said. I didn't like hearing that. I said, "You don't get to decide that." Olivia stayed calm. "I wasn't deciding anything." Daniel raised his voice slightly. "Stop acting like I'm doing something wrong." I stepped back. "Then explain why I feel replaced every day." Daniel looked frustrated. "You're making this bigger than it is." I shook my head again. "No, I'm finally seeing it." Olivia looked uncomfortable. "I think I should leave," she said. Daniel shook his head. "Stay," he said quickly. I felt something break inside me at that moment. I said quietly, "It's fine. I'll go." Daniel said, "Ethan, wait." I stopped walking but didn't turn around. "What do you want from me, Daniel?" I asked. I heard him hesitate. "I want things to be normal again." I laughed bitterly. "Normal? Nothing is normal anymore." Olivia said softly, "This isn't helping." Daniel finally walked closer to me. "Ethan, you're my best friend." I looked at him directly. "Then act like it." Silence fell between all three of us. I could hear my own heartbeat. Olivia broke the silence. "Maybe this is getting out of control." I nodded slowly. "Yeah, it already is." Daniel looked like he didn't know what to say. I finally turned back to Daniel. "Do you choose her over everything we had?" I asked. Daniel froze. "That's not fair," he said quietly. I shook my head. "I just want the truth." Daniel lowered his gaze. "I don't know what's happening anymore." Olivia stepped back slowly. I felt my chest tighten. I said, "Then maybe we're already over." Daniel whispered, "Don't say that." I looked away. "But it's already being said in my head." Silence stretched again. Daniel finally spoke again, his voice softer now. "I don't want to lose you." I felt my throat tighten. "Then don't." Olivia looked between us again. "This isn't just about me," she said quietly. I nodded. "It never was." I stepped back slowly. "Whatever this is, I can't do it anymore like this. Daniel reached out but stopped. I turned away completely. I just need space from all of you. I walked down the hallway alone. Behind me I heard Daniel call my name, but I didn't stop. Olivia didn't say anything. I kept walking, feeling something inside me finally break in silence. I stopped outside the school gate. I didn't look back. Maybe James was right, I whispered to myself. But it didn't change how empty I felt. The friendship I trusted was already gone. I stood there for a long time before walking home alone under the fading sky. I knew nothing would ever be the same again. Not anymore. Everything had already changed forever inside me. I heard everything by accident. I was walking past the corridor when I stopped near the window. Olivia Blake was talking to Sophia Miller. I didn't mean to listen, but I did. She said, "Ethan is controlling Daniel," Olivia said. My heart froze. I stepped back slowly. "No, I'm not," I whispered to myself. But I couldn't unhear it. Later I confronted Daniel Cross. "Did you hear what she said about me?" I asked. Daniel frowned. "What are you talking about?" "Olivia said I'm controlling you." He looked away. "Why are you even listening to her?" he said. That hurt more than I expected. "I'm just asking," I said. Daniel raised his voice. "Stop interfering in my life." I went silent. "Ethan, you're making everything worse," he added. I felt my chest tighten. "I never controlled you," I said softly. He shook his head. "It doesn't feel like that." That was the moment something broke between us. We stopped talking after that day. Even in class we avoided each other. Mr. Harris noticed it. "Boys, everything okay?" he asked. Daniel said, "Yes, sir." I said nothing. After class Mr. Harris called me. "You seem distracted," he said. I replied, "I'm fine." But I wasn't. He sighed. "Friendship problems?" I looked down. "Something like that," I said. He nodded. "Talk before it becomes permanent." I didn't answer, because I already felt it was too late. Daniel stopped sitting with me. Olivia stayed close to him. And I stayed alone. Every smile I saw from them felt like a lie directed at me. I kept thinking about what Olivia said. "Ethan is controlling Daniel." I kept repeating it in my head. But I knew I never controlled anyone. Still, Daniel believed it. And that was enough to change everything. One afternoon I tried again. "Can we talk?" I asked Daniel. He didn't look at me. "I'm busy," he said. I nodded slowly. "Right," I said. Olivia passed by us. She didn't even look at me. I felt invisible. James Carter saw me later. "You look worse," he said. "I'm fine," I replied. He shook his head. "No, you're not." I stayed quiet. "Just let it go," he said. "I can't," I said. Because it already lived inside me. And I couldn't escape it. I walked home that evening slowly thinking about everything again. Daniel's words echoed in my mind. "Stop interfering in my life," I whispered to myself. I never wanted that. I never tried to control him. I just wanted my friend back. The next day school felt heavier than before. I saw Daniel and Olivia again together laughing quietly. I walked past them without saying anything. Daniel looked at me for a second but turned away again. That hurt more than I wanted to admit. Mr. Harris called the class for group activity. I ended up alone again. Daniel and Olivia were paired together. I tried not to look at them, but I could hear their conversation clearly. She explained everything calmly. He listened carefully. I felt invisible again. Mr. Harris walked between desks, noticing the tension. He stopped near me. "Ethan, you okay?" he asked. I nodded quickly. "I am fine, sir." He looked unconvinced. "Try not to let personal issues affect your studies," he said. I nodded again, but my mind was somewhere else. After class I saw Daniel leaving with Olivia again. I called out his name, but he did not stop. I stood there helpless. James Carter came beside me. "You need to move on," he said. I looked at him. "I cannot," I replied. He sighed. "It is not worth destroying yourself over this." I stayed silent because I did not know what else to say. That night I sat alone in my room thinking again about everything. Olivia words, Daniel's silence, and the distance between us. I opened my phone but did not text anyone. I remembered Daniel saying "I am busy" and Olivia saying nothing at all, but still changing everything around me. The next morning I decided to try one last time. I walked to Daniel and stood in front of him. "Can we fix this?" I asked. He looked tired. "I am not sure," he said. Olivia stood nearby quietly. I felt everything collapsing again. Mr. Harris called us both after class. I knew something was wrong before we even entered the room. He looked serious. He said, "I do not want this conflict in my class." Daniel looked down. Olivia stayed quiet. I felt like everything was ending. I said, "I never wanted any of this." Daniel finally said, "I need space." I nodded slowly. Even though it hurt more than anything, I walked away again feeling completely empty. The hallway felt longer than usual. I heard footsteps behind me, but I did not turn around. I whispered, "I guess this is really over." I stopped near the exit and looked back for a moment. Daniel was still there with Olivia. I turned away for the last time. I walked into the empty street alone forever. I walked into school and saw Daniel and Olivia laughing together near the lockers. My steps slowed, but I forced myself to keep moving. I told myself it meant nothing. Olivia looked at me and said, "Good morning, Ethan." I replied, "Morning." Daniel didn't say anything. That silence already felt heavier than her words. Olivia leaned closer to him and said, "Ethan is toxic for you." I stopped walking. "What did you just say?" She looked straight at me. "You heard me." I turned to Daniel. "Daniel, say something." He avoided my eyes. "It's not like that." I said, "Then what is it?" Olivia answered instead. "He controls your choices." I shook my head. "That's a lie." Daniel finally spoke, but quietly. "Ethan, just leave it." I frowned. "Leave it?" "She's talking about me like I'm—" "Stop," Daniel interrupted. That single word hit harder than anything else. I stepped back. "So you're just going to stay silent?" Daniel sighed. "You don't understand." I said, "Then explain it." He didn't answer. Olivia said softly, "Maybe you need space from him." I laughed once. "Space from my best friend?" Daniel said, "We're still friends." I replied, "It doesn't feel like it." I walked away, but I could hear them still talking behind me. At lunch, I noticed people whispering around me. I caught fragments like jealous and controlling. My stomach tightened. One student said, "He can't handle Olivia being around." I stood up immediately. Mia Blake walked over and said, "Don't react to them." I said, "They're making me sound like I did something wrong." Mia replied, "People always talk." I said, "But this feels different." She hesitated. "Ignore it." I said, "How am I supposed to ignore this?" She didn't answer that. Across the yard, I saw Daniel and Olivia again together. He was smiling. I wasn't part of that moment. James Carter came beside me and said, "You're watching them too much." I said, "I can't stop." He replied, "It's eating you alive." I said, "It already has." He looked at me quietly. "Then talk to him properly." I said, "I tried. He shuts me out." James said, "Then give it time." I shook my head. Time is making it worse. Later, Mr. Harris called me aside after class. "There's tension everywhere," he said. I replied, "I didn't create it." He nodded. "I know. But it's affecting everyone." I said, "I just want things normal again." He said, "Then fix it." I whispered, "I don't know how." He said, "Start with honesty." I didn't respond. After school, I found Daniel near the gate. "We need to talk," I said. He sighed. "I'm busy." I said, "When will you not be busy?" Olivia stood beside him silently. Daniel said, "You're making this harder than it is." I said, "I'm trying to save it." He looked away. "Just stop." I said, "Stop what?" He replied, "Stop pushing." I said, "I'm not pushing. I'm losing you." That made him go quiet. I said, "Say something real." He said, "I don't know what you want anymore." I said, "The truth." Silence stretched between us. Olivia said, "This isn't helping either of you." I turned to her. "Stay out of this." Daniel said, "Ethan, just go home." I stared at him. "So that's it?" He didn't answer. That silence was the final answer. I nodded slowly. "Okay." I walked away, hearing nothing behind me. On the way out, I passed students still whispering. I felt like I wasn't even part of the school anymore. James caught up and said, "You look done." I said, "I am." He said, "Don't let this define you." I replied, "It already did." That night I sat alone, replaying every word. Daniel's silence. Olivia's accusations. My voice no one wanted to hear. I looked at my phone but didn't open it. For the first time, I didn't expect a message anymore. I just sat there, realizing I had lost him without even seeing the moment it happened. After losing Daniel, I stopped talking much. Home felt empty. My Uncle Robert kept trying to reach me, saying, "You can talk to me, Ethan." I replied, "I'm fine." He said, "You don't look fine." I turned away and said nothing. At school, I saw Daniel and Olivia together every day. I whispered, "So this is my replacement." James Carter sat beside me and said, "You need to eat something." I said, "I'm not hungry." He frowned and said, "You're disappearing, man." I said, "I already disappeared to them." James replied, "Don't destroy yourself for people who left you." I stayed silent for a moment. Then I said, "It's not that simple." He said, "It is if you stop feeding it." Olivia walked past and said, "Ethan, are you okay?" I said, Why do you care now? She stopped but didn't answer. Daniel looked at me briefly but said nothing. That silence hurt again. Later I sat alone behind the school. I said to myself, I was never this alone before. James came again and said, You're breaking yourself. I said, I'm already broken. He replied, Then rebuild before it's too late. I laughed and said, Rebuild with what? They took everything. James said, They didn't take you. I said, It feels like they did. My Uncle Robert called me that night. He said, Come home early. I said, I am home. He paused and said, That's not what I meant. I didn't reply. The next day Daniel finally spoke to me. He said, We can't keep doing this. I asked, Doing what? He said, This distance. I replied, You started it. He said, I didn't mean to. I said, But you did. Olivia stood beside him quietly. She said, Maybe space is better. I looked at her and said, You already got it. Daniel said, Stop blaming her. I said, I'm not blaming, I'm stating facts. He said, You've changed. I said, No, I just stopped pretending. James pulled me aside later and said, Listen to me. I said, I am listening. He said, Don't destroy yourself for people who left you. I froze at that sentence again. I said, Then what do I do? He said, Start choosing yourself. I stood there for a long time. I said, I don't know how. James said, Then learn. That night I stopped replying to messages. I sat alone and thought, if I keep holding on, I'll lose myself completely. I whispered, Maybe I already have. The next morning I walked into school and felt different. I said, Nothing matters anymore. James looked at me and said, That's not true. I replied, Then prove it. He didn't answer immediately. Olivia passed by and said, You've been avoiding everyone. I said, Everyone avoided me first. Daniel stood beside her and said, That's not fair. I laughed and said, Fair? None of this was fair. He said, We didn't mean for it to go this far. I replied, But it did. My voice felt colder now. James grabbed my arm and said, Stop. I looked at him and said, Why? So I can feel less. He said, So you don't lose yourself. I paused. Maybe I already did lose myself, I said quietly. He replied, Then find what's left. At lunch I didn't sit anywhere. Daniel called out, Ethan? I kept walking. Olivia said, Please talk. I stopped and said, Talk about what? How I disappeared. Daniel said, We can fix this. I shook my head and said, No, you fixed it already. Later Mr. Harris called me again. He said, Your grades are dropping. I replied, Everything is dropping. He said, That's not an excuse. I said, It's not an excuse, it's reality. He sighed and said, You need support. I said, I had support. I lost it. James met me after school and said, You're changing. I said, I have to. He said, Not like this. I replied, Then how? He said, Slow down. I laughed and said, I stopped slowing down when they stopped caring. That night I stood outside my house and said, I don't recognize myself anymore. My Uncle Robert opened the door and said, Come inside. I said, I am inside already. He said, No, you're not. I finally looked at him and said, Then I guess I'm nowhere. He didn't respond. I went to my room and whispered, This is what being left feels like. Then I said, Or maybe this is what I become. James found me at the gate again and said, You can still turn this around. I said, Turn what around? There's nothing left. He said, There is you. I looked at him and said, That's not enough anymore. He grabbed my shoulder and said, Stop giving them control over your mind. I replied, They already took it without asking. He shook his head and said, Then take it back. I stayed quiet for a moment and said, I don't know if I can. James said, Then start anyway. I nodded slowly but didn't feel convinced. As I walked home I said, Maybe pain is all I have now. Then I whispered, And maybe that's what makes me change. I kept walking without looking back again tonight. I decided to change my life. I told myself, no more looking back. The morning felt different when I walked into school. James Carter saw me first. He said, You look calmer today. I replied, I'm trying something new. He smiled and said, Good. Keep it up. Mr. Harris called me after class. He said, I've noticed your effort. I said, I'm just focusing on studies. He nodded and said, that's the right direction. At lunch, Mia Blake sat near me. She said, "You've been quiet lately." I replied, "Quiet is better." She said, "Or maybe stronger." I looked at her and said, "Maybe?" I ignored Olivia Blake when she tried to approach me in the hallway. She said, "Ethan, can we talk?" I didn't stop walking. I said, "No." James later said, "That was cold." I replied, "I need distance." He said, "Or control." I said, "Maybe both." Days passed like that. I studied more and talked less. Teachers noticed it. Mr. Harris said, "You're improving fast." I said, "I had no choice." Mia said one afternoon, "You're not the same Ethan anymore." I replied, "That's the point." She said, "People will notice." I said, "Let them." James asked me, "Are you really okay?" I said, "Better than before." He frowned. "That doesn't sound true." I said, "It is now." One day Olivia finally stopped me. She said, "Why are you ignoring everything?" I looked at her and said, "Because everything once ignored me." She said, "That's not fair." I said, "Neither was losing myself." She looked hurt and said, "We never meant to hurt you." I replied, "Intentions don't change results." I walked away again. James caught up and said, "You're building walls." I said, "I'm building myself." He said, "At the cost of everything else?" I said, "Yes." Mr. Harris later said, "Don't isolate yourself." I replied, "I'm not isolated. I'm focused." He sighed, "Focus can become loneliness." I said, "I can handle it." Mia smiled once and said, "You're becoming stronger." I said, "I have to be." She said, "Why?" I replied, "Because weakness already cost me too much." James said quietly, "Don't let pain define you." I said, "It already shaped me." He said, "Then reshape it." I said, "That's what I'm trying." Olivia tried again near the gate. She said, "Please talk to me." I stopped briefly and said, "We already said everything." She said, "No, we didn't." I said, "We did. You just didn't hear it." I walked away and didn't turn back. James said, "You're shutting everyone out." I replied, "Not everyone. Just what hurts me." He said, "That includes people who cared." I said, "They cared too late." Silence followed. At home, my Uncle Robert said, "You're different now." I replied, "I had to change." He said, "Change shouldn't feel like emptiness." I said, "It feels like survival." That night I studied until late. I said to myself, "This is my reset." I whispered, "No one else decides my direction anymore." James texted me, "Proud of you but don't disappear." I didn't reply immediately. I finally wrote, "I'm not disappearing. I'm rebuilding." The next morning I said, "I'm done being weak." James looked at me and said, "Just don't lose yourself in the process." I replied, "I already lost who I was. I'm finding someone better." Mia overheard and said, "That sounds heavy." I said, "It is, but it's mine." She nodded slowly. Olivia watched from a distance but didn't speak. I said to myself, "Silence feels cleaner now." James walked beside me later and said, "So this is your new life?" I said, "Yes." He asked, "Are you happy?" I paused and said, "Not yet." He said, "That's honest." I replied, "It's all I have left." I kept walking forward, feeling less broken than before. I said, "I'm not finished yet." James smiled slightly and said, "Good. Don't be." I kept walking forward knowing I was no longer the same person anymore. I found out the truth in the most unexpected way. Sophia Miller called me after school and said, "Ethan, I need to tell you something." I replied, "Why now?" She said, "Because I can't keep quiet anymore." I met her behind the library. She looked nervous and said, "Olivia has been manipulating everything." I frowned and said, "What do you mean?" She said, "She changed how Daniel sees you." I said, "That's not possible." She shook her head. "I have proof." She handed me her phone. I looked at the messages. My hands went cold. I said, "These are real?" She said, "Yes." In the texts, Olivia was writing things like, "Ethan is controlling him, and he needs space from Ethan." I whispered, "Why would she do this?" Sophia said, "She didn't like losing influence over him." I stepped back and said, "So everything was planned?" She said quietly, "Yes." I walked away without saying anything else. My head felt heavy the whole way home. I kept repeating, "It wasn't me, it wasn't me." The next morning Daniel Cross came to me. He looked different. He said, "We need to talk." I said, "Now you want to talk?" He said, "I know everything." I replied, "Do you?" He nodded slowly. Sophia showed me the messages. I laughed once and said, "So now you believe me?" He lowered his head. I was wrong. I stared at him. "Wrong doesn't fix what you did." He said, "Ethan, I didn't know she was." I interrupted, "You didn't know because you didn't care enough to ask me." He went silent. I said, "You never trusted me once, Daniel." He said softly, "I thought I was doing the right thing." I replied, "By abandoning me?" He didn't answer. Olivia Blake appeared at the end of the hallway. The moment she saw us, she froze. I said, "So this is it." She said quickly, "It's not what you think." I laughed bitterly. "Then explain it." Daniel turned to her. "Tell the truth." Olivia shook her head. "It got out of control." I said, "No. You controlled it." She said, "I was just trying to help Daniel." I cut her off. "By destroying me?" Silence spread through the hallway. Students started gathering. Someone whispered, "Is that true?" Another said, "She did all that?" Olivia looked around and said, "This isn't fair." I said, "Nothing about this was fair from the start." Daniel stepped back from her. "You lied to me." She said, "I didn't mean it like that." I said, "But you did it anyway." Her voice cracked. "I didn't want it to go this far." I shook my head. "But it did." James Carter came running and said, "What's going on?" I said, "Everything just came out." He looked at the messages on Sophia's phone and said, "Damn." Mr. Harris arrived and said, "Everyone back up." He looked at Olivia and said, "Is this true?" She didn't answer immediately. That silence said everything. Daniel said, "She manipulated all of us." Olivia finally said, "I didn't think it would hurt anyone." I stepped forward and said, "You didn't think at all." She looked at me and said, "I never hated you." I replied, "You didn't need to hate me to destroy me." She broke down slightly. "I just wanted things to stay the same." I said, "You changed everything instead." Mr. Harris said firmly, "This is serious. We will handle this properly." Students kept whispering. The truth was already spreading faster than anyone could stop. Daniel looked at me and said, "I'm sorry." I said, "You already said that before." He said, "This time I mean it." I looked at him for a long moment. "You only mean it because you saw proof." He didn't deny it. I said, "That's the problem." Olivia stepped back slowly, realizing everything was falling apart around her. James whispered, "It's over for her." I said quietly, "No. It's over for all of us." Daniel said, "Can we fix this?" I shook my head. "Some things don't go back." He said, "I want to try." I said, "Try with who I used to be." "That person is gone." Silence again. Olivia finally walked away, tears in her eyes, surrounded by whispers. Daniel said, "Ethan?" I said, "Don't." He stopped. I turned away and said, "You found the truth. But it doesn't erase what I went through." James walked beside me and said, "So what now?" I said, "Now I stop being the one who got broken." He nodded slowly. "And start being the one who rebuilds?" I said, "Exactly." Behind us, the chaos continued, but I didn't look back. For the first time, I didn't feel invisible. I felt finished with the past.